Hello, General Biology, and welcome to the second screencast, Section 4.2, Chapter 4. And we were introducing competition because we were talking about niches and community interactions. And one of the things that I had mentioned was competition. So if we defined competition, competition is going to be how one organism interacts with other organisms. And it's an important part of defining the niche. It occurs when organisms attempt to use the same limited ecological resource in the same place at the same time. So if we're talking about deer that are eating a certain type of plant within a field, let's say a 1-acre area, and we've got enough of this plant to feed 4 deer, what happens if we have 6? There's going to be competition for that resource. Or even if we have 8, we double it. There's going to be competition for that resource because they're going to be trying to get that food, that plant, in order to survive. So there's an example with roots in plants that compete for resources such as water and soil. So root systems will do that. When I was growing up, our neighbor had a willow tree in his yard, and willow trees have really long root systems, and they search for water, and there were a couple of willow trees. And in the root's search for water, it actually went through their basement wall and crashed in their basement wall, and the root was trying to get into their sump pump where there was a water source. So they had a lot of repair to do with that. Animals are also going to compete for resources such as food and mates and places to live and to raise their young. So that competition can occur between members of the same species. And if it happens between the same species, like the deer that I was talking about, it's called intraspecific. And this is, I hate terms like this because you have to try to come up with a way to remember it. So intraspecific, I think of the A and the A in same, and it's the same species, okay? So that's the same species competition if they're competing for the same resources. If it's between different species, it's known as interspecific competition. And that ER, I think of the ER here for different. And that's one of the ways that I try to remember what that means. And that can happen. We could have a coyote, which is a carnivore, and a mountain lion, which is a carnivore, and they live in an area that overlaps, and they're going to be competing for the food in that area that overlaps. Okay, so one of the things that we have in play, and you heard me mention this, is something called the competitive exclusion principle. And that competitive exclusion principle says that direct competition between different species almost always produces a winner and a loser, and the losing species is the one that's going to die out. So if they're not as adapted for survival, if they're not as strong, this is where survival of the fittest comes in, they're going to wind up dying out with this. So here's an example in this graph. There's Paramecium. Paramecium, you're going to see them, or hopefully are seeing them, in a lab that we're doing around this time. Paramecium kind of look like a fuzzy little slipper, like this. And these little hair-like things that I'm drawing on here are cilia. They are a freshwater unicellular organism. It's a protist. They have 2 nuclei in them, a large nucleus and a smaller nucleus. So this is the Paramecium. And we have two species of Paramecium, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. And what they did is they first allowed these to grow in separate cultures. So the graph here that you see are the separate cultures. And when they were in those separate cultures, as soon as they obtained the amount of food they could for survival, and they had reached carrying capacity, they leveled out. So under the same conditions, both of the populations were able to grow and then reach carrying capacity. However, when both species were put in together, this is the solid line, look at what happens with it. One species outcompeted the other, and the other one was less competitive, and that species didn't survive. So the Paramecium caudatum, it declined because the Paramecium aurelia was a better competitor, and the other one died out. In the cultures that you're going to be keeping in the lab that you're making communities, you're going to see this. You're going to see smaller ciliates, because a Paramecium is a member of the ciliates, and you're going to see hundreds of them compared to the larger ones that aren't going to be as many. And you're going to see that the smaller ones are going to be more effective in being able to survive. And then you're going to see the numbers of the smaller ones drop down, and the bigger ones pop up as carrying capacity is reached within the ecosystems and communities that you're making. So the competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy exactly the same niche in exactly the same habitat at exactly the same time. If two species attempt to occupy that same niche, one species will always be better at competing for limited resources and will eventually exclude the other species. So remember, I was talking about the mountain lion versus the coyote. If you ever had a chance to hold a cat is really flexible in its body. It can bend and move in many ways, and a dog is much more rigid. So even though they're carnivores, they don't necessarily occupy the same area. The mountain lion is much more flexible and can handle the rocky areas and will hunt within the rocky areas, where the rigidness of the coyote will keep it more in the leveled areas, the trees, and will hunt in that area. If they do have to overlap, and where the mountain community comes into the forest community, and you've got that area where they both could go in, one of them is going to wind up being more effective and force the other out. As a result of this competitive exclusion, natural communities rarely have niches that are going to overlap. Not significantly. They can, but not significantly. So as we talk about the competitive exclusion principle, let's take into account these three different kinds of warblers. They're a type of bird, small sparrow-like bird. They can all live in this same tree, but they will occupy different places within that tree. The Cape May warbler generally lives in the top of the tree, where the bay-breasted is going to live and make its niche within the middle of the tree. And then the yellow-rumped is going to be in the lower part. And because they occupy the different areas of that tree, they reduce the chance for that competition in their resources. Okay. So other relationships that happen to go on within these communities are predation, herbivory, and keystone species. So we're going to look at what shapes predation and herbivory communities. we're going to look at predators and how they can affect the size of populations within a community and determine the places where the prey can live and feed. And we're also going to take a look at herbivores that can affect the size and distribution of plant populations in a community that will help determine the places that certain plants can survive. So we have what we refer to as predator-prey relationships, and this is an interaction where one animal is going to capture and feed on another animal. So the one that is going to capture and feed is called the predator, and the other animal is going to be called the prey. Predators, their role is to keep population numbers in check. So they can affect the size of the prey populations in a community, and they can determine the places where the prey can live and feed. For example, there's moose, and moose are the predator for moose would be a wolf. And what we see is as the moose population numbers go down, the wolf populations go down. As the moose populations go up, the wolf populations go up. So there's a cause and effect for that population size. Moose eat vegetation, so they're herbivores. If there's too many moose that live in a particular area, then it's going to cause competition within the moose. Some are going to wind up starving. Starving means disease can come into the herd, and the herd could die. But if we have an ample predator in the area, that's going to help keep the numbers down. If there is a sick or weak or diseased moose, then typically those are the ones that the predators will get first. So they'll eliminate the weaker of the species. So birds of prey, for example, they can play an important role on regulating the population size of mice and voles, and other small rodents and mammals. Mice reproduce, I think, monthly or every other month, and they typically have like 10 to 15 babies at a time, so they really increase exponentially. But if we have owls, which is a bird of prey, they're going to help keep those numbers down. So here is a graph again. Again, please pay attention to graphics. We're going to see them on tests. This graph shows an idealized computer model of changes in predator and prey populations over time. So the blue represents the predator and the red represents the prey. So take a look at this. The prey numbers are going up. What's happening to the predator numbers? They're going to go up. So we get these predators that eat the prey numbers go down. What happens to the predator numbers? They go down. So without any predators, the prey can repopulate and they're going to go up. And when they go up, what's going to happen to the predator? They're going to go up as well. So you can see that they kind of follow this up and down. And that's how the dynamics of predator-prey relationships happen in general. We have herbivore-plant relationships. If there's interaction in which one animal, which is an herbivore, feeds on producers, which is a plant, this is called an herbivory relationship. Herbivores, like a lemur, they can affect the distribution of plants as well as the population of plants. And the distribution, because if they eat at a plant that has seeds or like burrs that can get into their fur, and then they go from one area to another and that seed or burr falls off and it's in the right conditions, then that plant can grow there. So they can affect these plant populations in a community, and they can determine the places that certain plants can grow and survive based on being a vector for dispersal. An example would be a very dense population of white-tailed deer. If they're eliminating their favorite food plants from many places across the United States, then there's going to be competition, but